Hello and welcome to another edition of Critical Q&A, the show where I answer your questions based on what you've left for me in the comments section of my Q&A videos or have sent to me by email at askchrisshelton@gmail.com. A couple things I wanted to point out or plug this week before we get going on the questions. One, Janice Grady has put out a book on her experiences in Scientology, and she was one of L. Ron Hubbard's original Commodore's messengers as a child. She has an amazing story of her time growing up in Australia with Scientology, moving to the Sea Org, and that whole experience being on the ship with Hubbard. Her mother was Yvonne Gillum, who is a very prominent figure in Scientology's history, especially with Celebrity Center. And her father is Peter Gillum, who is also pretty influential and big on, if you've ever been in Scientology, in the world of Scientology, then you know about Peter Gillum through vitamins. Anyway, he's not, I don't think he's connected with Scientology anymore, and Yvonne unfortunately passed away many, many years ago, and Scientology erased any real evidence of her existence, even though she was the one who really came up with the idea of Celebrity Center and really put it into place, and then Hubbard sort of took over. So anyway, her story, Janice's story, is absolutely amazing, and her book is the first of a series of books that are going to be coming out on her whole experience. I believe August 1st is the release date of those books, and I thought I'd just put a friendly plug in for her on my show here because it is well worth checking out. August 1st, Amazon, I think it's up for pre-order or pre-sales right now, so you can check that out. In addition, of course, to my book, Scientology A to Xenu, an insider's guide to what Scientology is really all about, which for those new subscribers here who watch my show, check this out, and don't know, I have written a book about Scientology myself, and it is up on Amazon, and you can check that out too. All right, that all being said, if you have not seen the video with interview that I did this last week with Kay Rowe, definitely you should check it out. It is a little mind-blowing in terms of some of the content in that video, and pretty horrible inside look at how the Sea Organization deals with people who have medical conditions. I wish that her story was unique and different and strange in the world of Scientology and the Sea Org, but unfortunately it's not. All right, let's get on with your questions now. We got some good ones this week. TTrev007. In your talk with Aaron Smith-Levin, you mentioned memory recall, ARC straightwire, not thinking of any possible downside. I would be curious if it could lead to false memory construction. Is it supposed to be real memory recall, or do the people involved know that you are reconstructing a memory? And Hamish Downey. Hi Chris, really love your show and thank you for always answering my questions. I just read this article on false memories and memory hacking on www.motherboard.vice.com, and I instantly thought of you. I wondered what you might make of it and any possible implications it has on the memories recovered during an auditing session. Yeah, false memories and memory goofiness. This is not something I'm an expert in. This is where you really got to get into the neurology of things in order to really get into how memory works. And there's just still, as far as I know from when I have looked into it, they're still figuring this stuff out. And Hamish, the article you sent to me from motherboard.vice.com, I looked at, and I can't really get behind everything that woman was saying as far as, well, any memory you have from earlier than 2 years old is a fake memory or false memory. I don't necessarily buy into that, this idea that, well, the brain doesn't construct any memories before you're 2 years old, because of course I'm going to refute that, because I have a very, very clear memory of my first birthday, and I've had it all my life. I didn't just come up with this memory through auditing sessions or through, somebody asking me about it, or through, some experience that somebody had where they were suggesting things to me. I just have always had that memory. So when she said, well, there's just nobody who ever remembers anything before they're 2 years old, I just instantly go, nah, it doesn't match up with my subjective experience. So, had a little bit of a hard time with that one. But I do absolutely go into the idea that false memories can be created, and that people can absolutely mistake imagination for memory. And if I'm doing that for my first birthday, maybe I am, right? But I've always had that memory, so I don't know, right? But I'm willing to be open to the idea that maybe if you could, somehow prove to me that there's just no way at all that that could ever be possible, then maybe I might review, whether I'm making up that memory or not. Now, when it comes to Scientology auditing, though, I will be a bit more critical about those memories because of a couple things. One, in the book Science of Survival from 1951, L. Ron Hubbard said that imaginary incidents are perfectly acceptable in running Dianetics on someone, and that if somebody says, well, we're just making it up, or I don't really know about this, Hubbard said it still had remedial or value in terms of helping the person, and you shouldn't discount it. Right? And in fact, it could even be helpful to sort of prime the pump in a way and get a person going by running things with Dianetics that were just known to just not be accurate or not be true. Now, therefore, that opened the door in Scientology to the idea that you could run things, and if you were imagining them or creating them, out of whole cloth, the auditor, because of the auditor's code in Scientology, where the auditor's not supposed to evaluate for the pre-clear or tell him what to think about his case or invalidate the pre-clear's case or gains in or out of session. Those are the first 2 points of the auditor's code, and they're really, really important in Scientology. So because of those 2 points, the auditor is going to be the last person who's supposed to tell the person, well, that's just imaginary and we're not going to do anything with it, right? And in fact, they'll go the other way and they will encourage a person to, run something in an auditing session that may be like the person's going, yeah, there's just no way this is true. The auditor goes, it's all right, just go ahead and tell me what's going on, right? So there's that whole thing where you're making something up, or you suspect, well, this just doesn't really fly. Because here's what's happening, right? The auditor, almost every time that's going on, will be thinking to himself, this thing really happened to the person. Maybe this thing really happened to the person in a past life. But they're still going to think, the auditor's still going to have a tendency to go in a direction where they're going to think that whatever this person is making up actually did happen at some point. And if you give over to the idea that you're an immortal spiritual being who has lived a near infinite amount of time into the past, then you're willing to give over to the idea that just about anything and everything have happened to you at some point during that past, right? From, space technology, civilizations like Star Wars, to magic. Hubbard even talks in a couple lectures about the fact that back in the distant past, there was magic. Just, magic, right? Spellcasters and people flying around on creatures with wings and wizards and things. He doesn't get into a lot of detail about it. It's like a one-liner that he just drops in the middle of a lecture or two, right? But nothing is too fantastical to be brought up in an auditing session, and nothing that is brought up is going to be poo-pooed or say, yeah, there's just no way that's true. Unless you start bad-mouthing David Miscavige, okay, or L. Ron Hubbard. Then the auditor might start rejecting what you're saying, right? If you start saying that, if you were to go in an auditing session and you were to say that, David Miscavige assaulted me last week, the auditor might go, okay, what's going on here? And they might start doubting your word, right? Because that's now offending their biases about Scientology executives and leaders, right? So that's where they'll get critical of your memories, but they won't get critical of you flying around on some eagle with a 50-foot wingspan when you were a wizard, 3 billion years ago. So, it's a little bit funny. Now, as far as false memories go, like I said, I'm not an expert on this, but to directly address this, I will say that I know for a fact I made stuff up in auditing, especially on the false purpose rundown auditing that I was receiving when I was on the RPF, where it was required that you go back in time, millions of years ago and find incidents of wrongdoing that, where you were blowing up planets and stuff. I mean, really nasty stuff. And I would just let my imagination run wild with that stuff, right? And I didn't particularly have the idea when I was doing it that I was just riffing on my imagination. But I look at it now and I think, yeah, that's what I was doing. At the time, I was in this mindset, like I just explained to you, where I thought, well, anything's possible. Anything and everything has happened to me. So if I'm imagining it, or if I'm seeing it when in response to an answer to a question I'm being asked, then it's probably real, right? And out it comes, and which of course gives you the idea that Scientology lends itself to and encourages making up things that have happened in the far distant past or within this lifetime in order to answer the auditing questions, right? Because if the guiding thing in an auditing session is, one, what the pre-clear is thinking, and two, what the e-meter is doing. And I have my finger here for the needle on the e-meter, ding, ding, right? When it reads on something, the auditor's going, hey, what's that? You know, and it doesn't matter to the auditor what comes up, right? The auditor will sit there and watch the meter, and it registers, and he goes, what's that thought that you just had? The guy goes, oh, it's crazy. I don't care. Tell me what it is, right? And I go, well, I imagine, you know, and sometimes it could be a little bit of something, right? You have to develop it like a Polaroid picture, you know. Well, I see a corner of a desk, you know. All right. Where's the desk? What color is the desk? Is it in a room? Is it outside? What, you know, tell me all about this. And you start developing this picture, right? And sure, you know, absolutely that can lend itself to false memories. So I think in all of this, you know, kind of long explanation I've given here, you get the idea of the flavor of what goes on in auditing and answering auditing questions and how anything goes. So of course, imaginary, you know, answers could come up. And yeah, I think that there could be negative repercussions to that if a person starts believing that things happen to them that of course never could or would have happened. So, and that's one of the problems I have now with auditing, right? That it does that and encourages that. And I don't think that's a healthy way particularly to rehabilitate or remedy a problem that a person's having or deal with issues that they're having. So that's my take on that. Jonathan Mark. When I watched a DC television station's broadcast of ABC 2020's report on Ron Miscavige, I saw a Scientology ad during one of the commercial breaks. Why would Scientology buy a TV ad in the middle of a program that good Scientologists are not supposed to watch? I thought Scientology's rare TV ads, for example during the Super Bowl, are designed to impress existing Scientologists about how far-reaching the church's PR is. Broadcasting an ad that few good Scientologists would see seems contrary to that purpose. How do you explain this contradiction? Well, it seems rather obvious to me. If you have the opportunity to counter what someone, you know that you have a TV show that is airing that is negative or is critical of you or your organization, what better time to buy, to do ad buys to promote your organization in what you would consider to be the best possible representation of it, which is what those commercials are, to try to counter the bad PR of Ron Miscavige bad-mouthing, his son David and the Church of Scientology. And I think that's why they did that, and I don't think it's really a whole lot more complicated than that. Also, you mentioned that this was in Washington, D.C. That is where Scientology has not only an ideal, this founding Church of Scientology, which is a fairly significant, location for them, but they also have a PR office, a government affairs office there, and they're going to want to counter, if they have politicians watching this show in D.C. or government officials watching it, they're going to want to at least get their word in to those guys that, hey, we're here, we're good, we're doing good works, we're spiritual in nature, and we're just a, fine bunch of folks. And that's what those commercials sort of portray. So I think that was the target audience in that particular case. I doubt that they did nationwide ad buys on all stations, all affiliates. I think they again targeted areas where there were, ideal orgs or where they probably thought there would be some return on the investment. And Washington, D.C. would make sense as a place where they think they would get some kind of a return on that. So that's sort of a secondary use, I think, of those Scientology ads and commercials, in addition to the primary purpose, which I will still stick to my guns on, that those ads are for Scientologists, and that they are there to give Scientologists a morale boost and an impetus to continue to pay towards Scientology, because they think that its that its good name and reputation are being upheld by the church by putting out those ads, like, say, at the Super Bowl or other major events. So that's my opinion on that. Xenu Hiltunen. The International Association of Scientologists bilks millions of dollars when building ideal orgs, but once they're opened, there's no chance they will ever be financially self-sustaining. So they must be subsided by the Church of Scientology and cannot be closed, sold, or repurposed for profitable business. So isn't the Ideal Org program counterproductive? The Ideal Org program is absolutely counterproductive, but not for the reasons you stated here. Okay, let me give you a little bit of history on this, or a little bit of my experience with running Scientology organizations from a management position. And one of the problems that the Ideal Org program absolutely did solve. When I was in management, which was from 1995 until 2003 or so, we were faced with mortgage issues, rent problems all the time, from the small, struggling orgs that weren't making it as far as being able to pay their mortgage or their rent. And this was a real problem, and especially, I mean, this was a gigantic problem that was on our shoulders over and over and over again. And one of the reasons it was a problem is because you had, or where it was a problem, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, Valley, the Valley organization in California, constantly having, we had to move them like 3 times because they kept not paying their rent. They just weren't making, enough money. Santa Barbara had a problem a couple times, Salt Lake City, Kansas City. One of the first things I did when I joined the Sea Org was flew out to Kansas City with somebody else as a Sea Org member, to go out and help them make money to hold on to their building, because they were like 3 or 4 months behind on their rent, and they were about to get the boot. So renting properties or leasing properties was a real headache for the orgs if they fell behind on their rent, because it just became this, like, snowball effect. They don't make it 1 month, then they can't make it up, then they can't make it up, and it just becomes this big issue. So when that happened, by the way, we had to pay their rent, right? Because it would float up to us as Continental Management to deal with the orgs that we were mismanaging so badly that they weren't able to make their rent, right? And there's a certain point to that. I mean, as management, that was our job. So it fell on us, and we had to, out of our own money and our own reserves, pay for those orgs' rent or pay their mortgage payment. This happened over and over again. I mean, one time there was a period of about 6 months where we got no pay at all for weeks and weeks and months, because our reserves and our own management income had been stripped to the bone in order to deal with these dying organizations that were going to die if we didn't deal with it. And the one principle that we absolutely, I mean, it was law, right, was orgs do not close, ever, 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 right? So there was no excuse, no way that this was not going to be resolved, and the pressure was on us, right? So we had to deal with that. Now, when the Ideal Org program came along, and part of this program being to buy the building outright and own it, that solved the lease rent problem. Just solved it. Because if you own your own building, and as the Church of Scientology, I don't think they're even making property taxes payments, all they have to do now in their new building is pay the utilities, pay the upkeep for the building, right? Just manage it. Just manage to keep the doors open. Just manage to pay the lights, pay the heat, right? Pay the air conditioning where that's necessary. And that's it. That's all they got to pay, which is a much less payment than the lease and the rent and the mortgage tended to be, okay? You know, the only place I've ever wondered how they're dealing with it is in Twin Cities, right, where they have a 90,000 square foot building that they have to keep heated for, you know, 8 months out of the year when it's freezing out there. That's an expensive utility bill, right? But even then, it's just a few $1,000 versus, you know, the fact that Twin Cities was almost booted from their building, you know, many times. So that is what that problem became a solved problem by the IdeaOrg program, and that's not why it's counterproductive, right? The reason why it's counterproductive is because it is it's making false promises to the public, and it's going to drive more Scientologists away from the church eventually than it will bring them in, because it's attempting to solve a PR problem and a service problem that Scientology has with nice fancy quarters, right? And nice fancy quarters might have satisfied Tom Cruise's need for, you know, someplace nice to bring his friends to when he wanted to talk about Scientology with them, but it doesn't solve anything when it comes to bringing, you know, your every person, your every man or every woman in off the street and getting them to come into the church and partake in Scientology services. The quality of the quarters was never the thing that was bringing people into Scientology. And all you got to do is look at how crappy a lot of the churches were in the 70s and 80s, yet they were full. They were full up with people, right? There were all kinds of people coming in and doing Scientology. And so it didn't really have a whole lot to do with the quality of the desks and the chairs and the building, right? But Miscavige got it in his head that it did, and then so they have been on this whole roll to buy new buildings and renovate them and pocket millions and millions of dollars in the process for the church, because the amounts that they're having to fundraise for these buildings is way in excess of what they're paying for the building and for what they are, and then they're paying the church directly to renovate the building, hire contractors, do all that work. That the church is making out like a bandit on all of that. So to that degree, financially speaking, it's not counterproductive for David Miscavige, but on a longer term look, like David Miscavige is a piss poor manager, right? If he was a good manager who actually wanted to see Scientology expand, he would not be doing it the way that he's doing it. So that's so it's productive, counterproductive, but you know, for different reasons. BTC. First off, I find it painfully obvious that fair game, or something like it, is alive and well to this day. However, the church claims that it was canceled as early as 1968. Hubbard apologists would take the position that any fair game practiced today is Captain Dave's doing and can be in no way charged to Hubbard, while critics claim that Hubbard did not cancel fair game itself, but that he canceled only use of the term for PR reasons. To your knowledge, was the practice and/or terminology in use after 1968, or did they rebrand the harassment of persons non grata? As recently as in the Monique Rathman lawsuit, the church defended harassment as a religious practice that should be, as they claimed, outside of the purview of U.S. law. Were they defending their right to fair game or something else entirely? Well, as you said, it's pretty obvious that the church still engages in fair game harassment and stalking and, you know, do anything that they feel that they need to in order to silence critics that they have targeted for whatever reason they've targeted them. Now, with all of the bad PR that has been generated, especially in the last 10 years, they have had to tone that down quite a bit compared to what they used to get away with in the 1970s and 80s. And even into the 90s, right? So it's a whole different world now in regards to what the church does now versus what they used to do. Yes, they do still harass people, they do stalk people, they do make hate websites about them, they, you know, stalk them around on Twitters, you know, and this kind of stuff. But that's nothing compared to what Paulette Cooper had to endure, for example, through the 1970s with Operation Freakout, which is the subject of Tony Ortega's book. And, you know, that was hardcore infiltration of her life, trying to get her to commit suicide, trying to frame her for, you know, a bomb threat on the church, which the church itself manufactured. I mean, really nasty stuff. Is the church still capable of doing that? Of course they are. You know, would they do that kind of thing now? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how far they'd be willing to go now. I think it would depend on the target, and I think it would depend on how much damage was being done to the church as to how far they'd be willing to go. So, is this practice still in use, though? Well, as you said in the question itself, absolutely it is. That was the whole subject of Monique Rathbun's lawsuit against the church. So, do they call it fair game? No, they probably don't, right? I never heard that term used in all the years that I was in Scientology for an operation being carried out against somebody else. We never, ever used it as part of the lingo of, oh, he's getting fair gamed, or we're going to fair game him or something, right? So it had, at least internally, in the circles I ran in, and I ran in a few of them, that term was not in use. I think when Hubbard canceled that back in '68, then internally they stopped using that. But that didn't mean that they stopped doing it, right? And the evidence of that is numerous, repeated testimonials from people in and out of court as to how they were harassed and stalked and fair gamed, right? So the use of the term is pretty much, from what I've seen, used by critics, right? It's used by people who have been the target of that. And they correctly call it fair gaming because it's exactly what Hubbard said to do. But the church, may or may not call it that, but really we're just talking semantics now. We're not talking about the actual what they do. And as far as their defense of it in Monique Rathbun's case, I can't be totally sure about this, but I believe they were arguing on free speech merits. That, people who were standing outside the Rathbun's home shouting in at them and standing around out there and just the squirrel buster signs and the various things they were doing was all a matter of First Amendment free speech, right? And anybody can do that anytime, anywhere they want, as long as they're on public property. You can't go onto private property and do that sort of thing, of course. You can't climb fences and go into a private apartment complex and do that to somebody. But if you're standing on a public sidewalk outside their house, you can picket. You could, shout whatever you wanted to. You could do, if you were following the law, you could make, whatever level of noise you could make before the police were called out. So there's a lot of freedom of speech that we have in this country, that people are given the right to express themselves. And we like that right, and we want to have that right, but we don't want to have people stalking and harassing people either. So there's a line that needs to be drawn there, and that line is supposed to be drawn by the courts, and that's what that suit was all about. But we didn't get a chance to see where that was going to go because Marty Rathbun pulled the plug on that. So that's what I can say about that whole subject. Fuzzy Skinner. You mentioned the spirit of play as an element of running an org. How does this coexist with the dim view Hubbard took and modern Scientologists take of joking and degrading, J&D? Is this another instance of the cognitive dissonance that is used by many destructive cults to keep their members off balance? All right, I looked up this quote that Hubbard gave. This is from a 1952 lecture from the Philadelphia Doctorate course, where it's called, the name of the lecture, it's the 26th lecture in the course, and it's called Flows, Characteristics of. And in it, Hubbard first mentions, or first starts talking about this idea of a spirit of play. And he says, here's the exact quote on it. There's nothing succeeds like insouciance. Plain flippancy will actually get more done in less time than anything else you can name. As we go up the tone scale and things become lighter and lighter, a person can of course become much more ethical and at the same time lots less serious. It sounds funny that a person who is very serious is liable to fall short on his ethics. As we get up the tone scale, we find that individuals are airier and lighter and actually more aesthetic. And the more serious you take the game, the less chance there is of winning it. This tells you it takes lots of space and lots of unseriousness to win. Now that was in 1952 when Scientology was still fairly new and fresh, and it was a very different atmosphere than when we move forward 13 years later in 1965 when L. Ron Hubbard is writing Keeping Scientology Working and saying that Scientology is a deadly serious activity, win or die in the attempt, and there's no such thing as being half-minded about being a Scientologist. So clearly there was a, viewpoint change over the years as Hubbard got more and more enmeshed and mired in, the seriousness of Scientology, and he started, kind of dreaming up these OT levels and the heavy duty stuff that had been done to people over all these centuries and millennia. He started making it out to be a much more serious thing. And so you have this idea in Scientology from the earlier works of a spirit of play, of, as you go up the tone scale and as things are more uptone, they're more fun and they're freer and they're livelier. And as you go down the tone scale, things get serious and solid, and stuff doesn't really get done so easily and so well. And Scientologists sort of interpret these two things as, they have to sort of mentally make those two things make sense. And so what they do is at least what I did and what I saw others do, is they treat Scientology as the top priority in their life. There isn't anything else more important than what they're doing with Scientology. And everything sort of focuses and aligns to it. And that's why, of course, why I joined staff and why I joined the Sea Org, for example. But while doing Scientology, while it is a deadly serious activity, and while it does matter whether, Scientologists clear the planet or not, and whether they make it or not, the way to act while you're in Scientology is to smile and be fun and be gay and free. And, I talked about this a little bit with Kay, actually, in my interview this week, that this forced gaiety that occurs in Scientology when they're doing things that, really, none of them really want to be doing, right? I mean, the fundraisers, really don't enjoy the fundraising. The people who are being fundraised don't really enjoy being fundraised, but they feel that it's necessary to do that because Scientology has to survive, and it has to make it, and it has to get more people on board, or we're all dead, right? I mean, that's kind of their view, is that if this doesn't happen, we're all dead forever. Not just now, but forever, right? And there's a good chance that the planet's going to blow itself up, and, all these various horrible, awful things that are going to happen. So they got to deal with that. But while they're doing it, let's do it with a smile, right? Why so serious? Right? This kind of view. So that's sort of the push and pull of what goes on in Scientology, and it is crazy making. I can tell you from personal experience that it just drives you absolutely batty, because it just messes with your head, and you're bouncing around between all these crazy priorities and all this nonsense that's going on, and then trying to use this spirit of play to justify really abusive mental and emotional behavior that's not healthy for people. So that's kind of how all that plays out, I guess. It is time for Flash Answers. Andy Lesser. Chris, question for you since you brought up OT8 on the ship. Have you ever heard of a situation where a Scientologist had seasickness and was allowed to do OT8 on dry land? Nope, not ever. Never heard of that. Hubbard wrote in some flag orders about how to deal with seasickness, so I'm pretty sure they would apply those remedies, and I'm pretty sure those remedies actually work because Hubbard was a real sailor, and he really did deal with people who really did have seasickness, and I think the remedies that they used are pretty much out of the naval, handbook. So that is how I think they deal with that sort of thing. I never even heard of anybody who went to the ship and had seasickness, though. No one I knew ever complained about that. And I suppose if it was a real problem, they could have waited until the ship went into dry dock, because periodically it would, in order to do refits and repairs, and then they still had people traveling to where it was, and they would do their services not on the ship while it was being retrofitted or renovated, but they would do them on land at some hotel that they might have rented or something like that for the short time that was happening. So theoretically that could have happened, but I never heard of it. Stu PS. What Linux distribution do you use? I don't use Linux. I haven't used Linux in many, many, many years. I got Windows installed on here, and I've got some, this is Windows 10 with some graphics emulation going on because I like the way my screen is set up like that. It looks kind of more Mac-like, but it's not a Linux setup. Amanda Burke. Are there an infinite number of Thetans? I mean, Hubbard would never have predicted that the world's population would expand the way it has, right? Do Thetans multiply? I don't know. Hubbard never talked about how many thetans were around. I do remember one place where he mentioned something about how a thetan could create another thetan somehow. I don't know how. They didn't really get into the details of it. This was another one of those like one-liners he just sort of throws out in the middle of a lecture. It's never really covered in a lot of detail. And, you know, I don't know. There aren't girl thetans and boy thetans. There's just, you know, thetans. And since he never really went into where they come from, they just sort of appeared, you know, and how they're created and that sort of thing. It's just not really detailed that well in Scientology. So I think the idea with the increasing population of the planet is that they're just floating around here on Earth. You know, they're all trapped here or stuck here over all this time. And honestly, it's a kind of a good question because Scientologists don't really think about this kind of stuff very much. So I find myself sort of like, you know, how do I answer this one, you know? Which just shows that it's not well covered in Scientology. Okay, that is our show for this week. I would encourage anybody who is enjoying my channel and enjoying what I'm putting out here to please join me on Patreon. That is at patreon.com/Chris Shelton, and become part of the major love support machine that keeps this channel going. Because it is you guys who keep me able to do what I'm doing here. So thank you very much for all of the support and love that you send through your comments and your donations and whatnot. It really, really does help, and it really makes a difference. So I will see you guys again next week. Toodaloo.